Good evening. As some of you are first-time attendees to our events, permit me to introduce myself and our association. My name is Michael Otten. I'm a co-founder of an ad hoc group of business, law school, and assorted other alumni, calling ourselves Reform Elections Now. Our creation in 2017 was inspired by business executive Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter. They asserted that the Democratic and Republican parties are a perfect duopoly, answerable more to their most loyal and often more extreme members rather than to voters. Gale and Porter hypothesized that election reform was the most effective way to make government work better and to provide us with improved choices of competitive candidates. Reform Elections Now is not made up of political scientists, but merely concerned and thoughtful citizens. However, we did note in the summer of 2020 some alarming risks that 19th century laws could disrupt the 21st century elections. Writings of the three professors who are with us today were a source of our concerns, which we passed on to numerous university groups that summer before the election of 2020. Perhaps most importantly, after the infamous events of January 6th, based largely on those poorly written 19th century laws, we turned to these same professors, who are also concerned citizens, to ask if they would come out of their ivory towers to help to remedy some of the more obvious problems. As did the political scientists of the 18th century, who provided the basis for the American Constitution. Today's professors created an election reform task force of academics and actually did share in the rewriting of two of those 19th century laws in what is now known as the Electoral Count Reform Act of 2022. We were honored to be the public platform for the launch of their task force in 2021, so it is fitting that we provide a similar platform for them to report on the work done since then and to prepare us to support what still needs to be done. Our principal speakers are the editors of a 359-page book reflecting the task force's work to date. And we will put the link to being able to order the book into the chat. They focus on ways to improve our political systems through thoughtful and evidence-based findings. They are working on nonpartisan roadmaps for the future to provide more competitive and better choices among candidates to represent us in a democratic way among our various citizenry. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome back today's panelists. Moderating it will be our very own Reform Elections Now co-founder and director of research, Peter Cyrus. Introducing their work will be distinguished N.Y.U. Sudler Professor of Constitutional Law, Rick Pildes, who has co-chaired the task force. And he is joined by fellow editors and task force drivers Larry Diamond, who is senior fellow from the Hoover and Freeman Foley Institutes at Stanford University, and Ned Foley, who's Charles and Florence Whitcomb Ebersold Chair in Constitutional Law and Director of Election Law at the Moritz College of Law, Ohio State University. We expect to have some time after the panel conversation at close to 7 p.m. Eastern Time to share ideas, answer questions, and discuss issues. So please type your thoughts into the group chat as they occur to you. Now let me turn the meeting over to Peter to frame the discussion.
Thanks, Mike. As most of you know, I am usually long-winded. So today I won't say anything because we have three people who I respect so much and who've done so much in assembling the group of academicians who've written this really outstanding book. So let me shut up, and we're going to start out the call by turning it over to Rick Pildes from N.Y.U. Rick?
Yeah, so thanks, first of all, very much to Peter and to Mike for supporting us, being engaged with these issues, helping to put this group together. Thanks to all of you for your engagement with these issues and your willingness to spend some time with us. I'll just make some opening remarks to sort of frame the general project that we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into the specifics after that. So we all know that the vast majority of Americans are not satisfied with the way American democracy is functioning. I assume that. So, just to put a number on this, in a recent Gallup poll, about 15% of people approved of the job Congress is doing. And that's close to historic lows. And of course, there are good reasons for this dissatisfaction. Congress increasingly seems unable to effectively address the major issues that lots of people, most citizens or many citizens care about. The congressional session that's about to end is considered the least productive since at least the Great Depression. We also know that one of the reasons the system is so unable to deliver is that the political parties have become more polarized than they've ever been, at least in 100 years, and maybe even more than that. A second factor in why Congress has become so dysfunctional is also that the parties are internally fragmented or divided in various ways. Obviously, we're seeing a display of this right now with the struggle over putting together the continuing resolution to keep the government functioning. And on top of this dysfunctional political process that we've been struggling with, our political culture more generally has also become more toxic, more tribalistic. As again, I'm sure you all realize, you all experience. We've seen the rise of what we call affective or emotional polarization, where people view people on the other side not as political opponents or the opposition, the loyal opposition even, but as actual enemies. And that's a very striking aspect of the political culture that we're in. So after the 2020 election, Ned and Larry and I decided to create this task force with one sort of overarching question in mind. Are there features of the way our institutions are designed, the way our elections take place, that unduly empower the more extreme forces in our politics and our political culture, and make government more responsive to the more ideological poles of the parties rather than citizens more generally? So, how much of the kind of hyper-partisan political culture that we've been living through is a function of the particular way we have structured our political process, our election process in particular? And do these current structures make it too easy for more factional or more extreme candidates to get elected, even when they don't have support from a majority of the general electorate, because of the way we structure the process? So when we put this task force together and we made calls to political scientists and law professors and others with longstanding expertise in the election process, we were very grateful at the response we got, and we ended up with a group of over 30 sort of experts who have been studying the political system, both here and some people in comparative perspective, for many, many years. And we got support, generous support, from a number of foundations. I should maybe thank them briefly here: the Arnold Ventures, the Skoll Foundation, Erica Lawson, an individual, and the New York Law School Center on Democratic Governance. And we had several commitments when we put the task force together about how we were going to do this work. So we wanted to bring to bear rigorous, current, empirical understandings or insights into the various proposals, political reform proposals that are out there. It's too common for political reform proposals to be based on sort of hope or wishful thinking or kind of herding behavior among reformers, without any real rigorous empirical kind of study of how these various proposals are in fact likely to work in practice. A second commitment we made is we didn't want to force an artificial consensus on the group. And within this report or book that has now been published, you'll see we actually play out differences of views that some of us had on particular issues. And we wanted to focus on practical institutional proposals ones that it's plausible to imagine being adopted, as difficult as political reform is. But we did not want to address issues like the Electoral College or the Senate, issues that require constitutional amendments that are, not on the horizon. Okay, so that was kind of how we thought about the project, what our commitments were. In the end, we focused on the following issues. First, possible changes to the structure of primary elections. Second, possible changes to voting rules, the rules that determine who actually wins an election, how you count the votes, how you aggregate the votes to determine the winner of the election. A third issue we discussed and analyzed was the possibility of moving to proportional representation for the US House, which some reformers have been advocating. A fourth issue was possible changes to the presidential nominations process. And then finally, a change to the way we finance our elections. Those were the areas we focused on. There's a chapter. I don't know if I hold the book up, whether it's going to be backwards. We should have tried this out beforehand. But this is what the actual published book looks like. And those are the five areas that we ended up focusing on. And ultimately, the larger point here, as you all know, is the kind of governance we get is a function of the incentives that the system, the institutional structures create for certain kind of people to run, for certain kind of people to be successful in campaigns, which affects the kind of people who go into governance, and then ultimately, as I say, what the system actually produces, what kind of democratic governance we get at the end of the day. So that's a brief overview of the project. I think Ned is going to start with our first substantive discussion about different ways of thinking about the rules we use to vote or to determine who has actually won the election. So Ned, let me kick it over to you.
Well, thanks, Rick. And yes, thanks to Mike and Peter, the whole group. We're really honored to be able to share our findings and discuss it with you. So I'm going to share my screen because I actually have some slides that hopefully everyone can see. So I assume I can see it. And I'm getting some nodded heads, so I assume you guys can see it as well. And just to illustrate the theme of the book and the problem that as Rick said, we're trying to address, this is an illustration of the degree to which the Senate, as part of Congress, has become more extreme and polarized over the last 20 years. So this is from a website called VoteView. You can quibble about the particular metrics they use to define where each member of the Senate is in an ideological space, but just as a rough illustration, it's pretty good. So, this is what the 100 senators looked like again, 20 years ago in 2004. And if you compare that to where it is now, hopefully you can see that, especially on the red side, just movement more to the extreme. And an example of this from my own state of Ohio is exchanging Rob Portman for J.D. Vance. We could illustrate that with other examples around the country, but over 20 years, that migration has tended to happen. And thinking about Ohio again, and how different voting rules can make a difference, I want to focus on the Senate election that just took place, this past November. And as I think everybody knows, Bernie Moreno, who is a Trump-endorsed Republican, ended up beating longtime incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown. But I want us to take us back to earlier in the process and think about how these candidates existed in the primary system and then moved on to the general election. And there were the top three vote getters in the primary as it existed. And of course, the current system is a separate Republican primary, separate Democratic primary, as you know. But if you take the votes in those primaries, Brown and Moreno were the top two vote getters. And then there was a third candidate named Matt Dolan, who was in the Republican primary, and he was running not as endorsed by Donald Trump and not seen as representing the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, but instead got endorsements from former Senator Rob Portman, incumbent Governor Mike DeWine, that part of the Republican Party in Ohio that has tried to resist the MAGA movement. And as someone who's been living in Ohio through the last few years, it's become clear that the MAGA wing is dominant, but there's been an internal struggle, kind of like what Rick was talking about, big divisions within the Ohio Republican Party. So, given these sets of preferences among Ohio's electorate at the first stage of the process, you can think about what would happen under different electoral systems in place. So if we have the current system, again, Moreno wins the Republican primary, so Brown is uncontested in the Democratic side, and we get the result that we get. If you're familiar with the California top two system, there you have a nonpartisan primary where all candidates run against each other, regardless of what party they're from, and the top two candidates move on to the general election. And I want to say that the work that we do in the book, and I'm only giving you tonight a narrow slice of what's in the larger book that, as Peter said, there's over 300 pages. The California system is definitely beneficial compared to the current system because of that use of the nonpartisan primary. And that in and of itself is an important reform. But depending upon the degree of polarization in a state, and different states have different degrees of polarization, the California system might not be strong enough medicine because under that system, given these preferences from Ohio, Moreno and Brown are going to be the two candidates who advance. And in November, you're going to get the same outcome as we would get under the current system. And that's also true with respect to this new system that Alaska has, which is called instant runoff voting. What many of you may know, what Alaska does is it uses that same all candidates, regardless of political party primary, that California has, but instead of only two candidates advancing to November, four candidates do. And then using a ranked choice voting ballot, voters rank their choices among those alternatives. And I'm simplifying here a little bit what we know in terms of who the fourth place vote getter in Ohio was in the primary. And you can pretty much realize that person would get dropped out immediately under this instant runoff system. The next candidate that would get dropped out is Matt Dolan, and those votes would get redistributed in a way that would end up being the final round of the instant runoff process would be, once again, Moreno versus Brown, and Moreno would win that. But we can contrast those three results that all lead to the same outcome with a different system, which comes from this French mathematician called the Marquis de Condorcet. And there are different ways you could design a Condorcet election. You could have a top four version of it. And from the voter's perspective, it would look just like the Alaska system with the same ranked choice ballots. The voters would rank their choices, but the tabulation would be different in ways that we could talk about it. It's also possible to do a top three Condorcet election without even using ranked ballots. And one reason, and that's discussed in the book, there's lots of different versions of different systems are discussed in the book. But one reason, maybe to mention this tonight, is that, as some of you know, ranked choice voting did not do well this year when it was proposed in various states. It fortunately survived an attempt to undo it in Alaska, just barely, but it did survive. But in other states like Colorado and Montana, where it was in Nevada, where basically different versions of the Alaska system were on the ballot, it regrettably got rejected. So one thing to think about in terms of the practical approach that Rick mentioned is like, what can be done to get the kind of reform that our government really needs, what states should be targeted, maybe we should think about an alternative that doesn't involve ranked ballots, because the Republican Party, unfortunately, became very hostile to ranked choice voting, in part because of how it happened in its first use in Alaska, again, that we could talk about. So let me just quickly mention what a top three system would look like where you don't use ranked ballots. Instead, voters in November would make direct comparisons between each pair of the three candidates. So voters would say whether they prefer Brown or Moreno, they prefer Dolan versus Brown, Dolan versus Moreno. Vote those choices directly. And we already know what the Brown versus Moreno choice is, because that's what people had this November, and that's what we've been talking about so far. But if it's Dolan versus Brown, that's a little more interesting because Dolan's another Republican. Ohio is a red-leaning state. If you look at election returns in Ohio in 2022, when DeWine was on the ballot running for governor again, the non-MAGA Republicans like DeWine actually do better in November than the MAGA Republicans like J.D. Vance. DeWine was a much stronger candidate, and it wasn't just DeWine, it was other non-MAGA candidates in 22. It's just that a non-MAGA candidate can't win a Republican primary. So there's every reason to believe that in Ohio, the direct head-to-head between non-MAGA Matt Dolan, much more moderate candidate, much more centrist, he would also beat Brown, the Democrat, perhaps even by a wider margin. And then also there's reasons to believe that Matt Dolan in November would beat Bernie Moreno, because all Ohio's voters, not just Republicans, would be voting between those two choices. Matt Dolan, again, being more moderate, more centrist, would be more likely to pick up votes, at least from those Democrats who say they don't want an extreme Trump-endorsed Republican like Moreno. And especially if Sherrod Brown would say to his Democratic supporters in Ohio, vote for me against my two opponents, because, I want you to vote for me. But in that third choice between Dolan and Moreno, I got to tell you, I prefer Dolan to Moreno. So that's what I'd like you to do if you support me and my values. We could talk about whether the Democratic Party would do that. But frankly, if you're a Democrat in Ohio, given the way Ohio is going, you'd be well advised to enter into an alliance with the Matt Dolan, Rob Portman win of the Republican Party, because Sherrod Brown proves that Democrats, even a relatively popular one like Sherrod Brown, cannot win statewide in Ohio. So if the Democratic Party is going to have any relevance in Ohio, it's going to be as a leverage between these two other wings of the Republican Party, and be a power broker, if you will, to support the moderate wing against the more extreme wing. So that leads me to wonder, in terms of which states reforms could be adopted. I think realistically, you have to look at the states where there are ballot initiatives, even if the referendums didn't work this last November. It's going to be hard to get legislatures themselves to adopt this reform. But Ohio has a ballot initiative. If we think about the states in which that they lean to the right, so Democrats are going to have a hard time winning, could there be a coalition of Democrats and the non-MAGA Republicans to support this kind of reform? So just to round this out, the book talks about computer simulations of elections, 100,000 elections, to show the difference between different kinds of systems. And I won't go into the detail here, but this shows that the example that I gave you involving Matt Dolan, Bernie Moreno, and Sherrod Brown is not a fluke, that this Condorcet system in general will give us winners who are closer to the median voter, whereas other systems, including the instant runoff system, are going to tend to give you winners that are more extreme. That's because of the polarization that exists among the voters themselves. Ohio is a particularly polarized state, even though it now leans to the right. Another state like this is Missouri. You know, Missouri used to be a battleground state like Ohio, and it went red before Ohio did. It used to be the bellwether, and it's showing that kind of trend. And Missouri is another state that has ballot initiative campaigns. And so think about whether or not this kind of top three Condorcet reform would be a good reform for a state like Missouri if you could get a coalition between Democrats in Missouri, who, like in Ohio, can't win at all, to align with less extreme Republicans to get that kind of reform. Another state to think about in this regard is Nebraska. It also has ballot initiatives. But notice Nebraska is not as extreme, is not as polarized a state in terms of its electorate population than Missouri or Ohio. And therefore, even though Condorcet's system gives you more moderate winners than IRV, even a state like Nebraska, the gap between those two systems is not as great. And this is an important point. If you're a doctor trying to prescribe medicine, you shouldn't do it in an ideological way. You should do it in a pragmatic way, as Rick said. And the medicine for Nebraska might be different than the medicine for Missouri or for Ohio. If you could convince the Nebraska system to like, Nebraska voters to like ranked choice voting, the instant runoff system would work pretty well there. And to generalize this point really quickly, I won't go into all the details behind this slide, but this slide basically tells you that the more polarized a state is, the bigger the difference between the Condorcet method versus the instant runoff method in terms of giving you results that are less extreme. You get more bang for the buck from choosing Condorcet if you have a more polarized electorate. If you have a less polarized electorate, there isn't as much of a difference between these two systems. We could talk about other states where this choice would make a difference. Somebody at the outset asked about Arizona. Arizona and Nevada are examples of very polarized states that are on the knife's edge 50-50. They were states that hoped to have reform. The reforms failed. The difference between Condorcet and instant runoff would be very valuable in those states. But frankly, I think the Democratic Party, which opposed this kind of any kind of reform like instant runoff voting in Nevada, is less likely to be a partner for reform in a state where they think they can win outright. So they think they can win in Arizona, they think they can win in Nevada. It seems to me strategically, if we want the reform movement to move forward, is to think about those states like Ohio, like Missouri, like maybe Nebraska, where you could build a reform coalition that could actually work. So let me stop there and turn it over to Larry for some additional thoughts.
So let me begin by saying that I ended our project much more firmly convinced about the value of the reform that I was most interested in when we began our project, which was ranked choice voting, but in particular, the form of ranked choice voting that involves nonpartisan primaries and that basically goes by the name of top four, the Alaska system, or top five, the Nevada system. And I'll talk about the fate of those two reforms in a little more detail in a minute. And after a lot of interaction with Ned Foley over a period of several years, of hearing various versions of the presentation that he has given and the data that he has presented, I certainly am convinced that the ideal form of top four, top five voting is with the Condorcet system, or something that would facilitate the winner, the Condorcet winner, emerging. And there are various ways of doing that. We live in a world where sometimes better is better than bad. And so, Ned knows what I'm about to say now. If I could get ranked choice voting without nonpartisan primaries, which is what Oregon was voting on this past November, I would take it, which is the main style system of ranked choice voting in party primaries and in the general election. I would take that over the miserable polarization feeding system we have now. And if I could get top four, top five, I would take that over ranked choice voting as it exists in Maine and would have existed in Oregon if the voters had voted, to my mind, the correct way this past November. And if I could get top four, top five nonpartisan primaries with ranked choice voting structured to take the Condorcet winner, I would take that over everything else. So maybe we should have that, choosing the Condorcet winner among electoral system choices. But in any case, we live in the real world, and so reform is going to be a long and incremental process. This is my first point. And it's a sobering point, and I think it's a deeply sad point. So now I need to say a bit about what happened this November. We talked about Arizona, where the incremental reform that might have resulted in nothing better than top two, right? That's part of what Ned was explaining, and which I'm not very enthusiastic about, because in the end, my experience in California tells me most of the time you get a Democrat and a Republican running against each other. It's had a little positive impact in terms of reducing polarization. I'd rather have it than the current system, but I don't like it on philosophical terms very much, because it also reduces the field prematurely too much to just two finishers in a low turnout party primary. And of course, that is part of the problem we're facing, that primaries attract low voter turnout. And who are the people who are most inclined to turn out in party primaries? They're the people who are most committed. And, there's a debate in the political science literature about whether these people are the most ideologically extreme. Some of the data says they're not, but they certainly are the most partisan. And frankly, they're the most inclined to respond when a party leader like Donald Trump says, I will primary you if you don't toe the line. And I have to say, oh God, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's the end of the year. And even though I haven't had my first cocktail at the end of the day, I'm just going to be honest here in saying that sometimes I roll my eyes at my academic colleagues. They get so lost in their theories and in narrow interpretations of the accumulation of data that they miss the forest for the trees. And so I'm just going to say here very, very bluntly, when you have every Republican senator quaking in fear that if they vote the wrong way on a confirmation vote for an obviously, manifestly, disgustingly unqualified candidate for a cabinet position, and They do so because Trump has made clear that he will run an opponent against them in their party primary, and they really believe they might well lose for that simple reason. I don't care what the political science literature says about, who votes in primaries and this and that. At some point, we have to follow the obvious signals we're getting in our politics and common sense. And common sense tells me, and I think that there is a significant accumulation of data that supports this, that party primaries are a very big part of the problem, and that at the state level, if we could switch to nonpartisan primaries and then some form of ranked choice voting after that, we would go a very significant way toward reducing not just our partisan polarization and maybe ideological polarization, but also the tendency, the erosion of checks and balances, I'll put it that way, that I think is now putting our democracy in greater danger. So I was very optimistic that we'd get some successes. I was also very optimistic that ranked choice voting was going to win 4 years ago in Massachusetts. It's a very educated state. There was a Nobel Prize winning economist who worked with us on our task force, Eric Maskin, who strongly endorsed the ranked choice voting provision there. But it's a tough sell when the party establishments come in against it. And then when you're trying to decide what to do, it's a low information election. It's a kind of it's a mental step to get from where we are to ranked choice voting. And if you haven't had a very rigorous and well prepared campaign, and if you can't answer the criticisms that are raised and really work at the grassroots to build support and counter this hostility of party establishments, and then you get a prominent I won't say nonpartisan, but relatively moderate centrist politician who seems kind of thoughtful and not ideologically charged, like Governor Charlie Baker, the moderate Republican in Massachusetts, coming out against it. That's the killer, and that I think played a big role in the defeat of ranked choice voting in Massachusetts a few years ago, and it played a big role in the defeat of ranked choice voting in Colorado this November when Senator Michael Bennet came out against it. And, I haven't done the deep kind of field research and deep inquiry of why these initiatives lost, particularly in 3 states where I thought they could win: Colorado, Nevada, and Oregon. But I think the campaign in Colorado, each probably had its own distinctive reasons. It made it onto the ballot very late. A lot of voters didn't understand it. The ballot proposition was not worded very clearly. Then Bennett came out against it. In Oregon, both of the party establishments were strongly against it. In Nevada, I think there was a factor in all these votes in November, that this extreme, ironically, because polarization is what we're trying to counter, but this extremely polarizing presidential election sucked a lot of the oxygen out of voter time, attention, understanding for something as far down the ballot as a ballot initiative. And the MAGA movement, I think, really kind of mobilized a lot of voters in Nevada, perhaps who didn't vote in previous elections or didn't vote in the preceding election 2 years before when the voter initiative passed for the first time, but 52-48, but it was a constitutional amendment, so it had to be adopted a second time. So all of this is to say that if you go, and then I'll turn it over to Rick in just a couple minutes. If you go across all of the reforms we considered, our other working groups on party primaries, on campaign finance, on presidential primaries, what they converged on with reform, what were reforms that I think were intriguing and that I favor, but that were either pretty incremental reforms, like, for example, for party primaries, maybe having a common date in the United States when state level primaries would occur, so there'd be higher turnout and they wouldn't be so selective and voters would focus on them more, or with campaign finance, maybe at least focusing on transparency. That's something where I think we could really get more consensus. And they had a very interesting insight there that we should raise the limit at which transparency reporting is required so that small donors aren't intimidated, from making contributions by having them be revealed. But big donors, we really will have more sunshine on what they're doing. But none of them were, like shocking transformations. And on campaign finance, we are, of course, constrained by the Citizens United and related Supreme Court decisions. Rick might say a bit more about a major recommendation in our report, which was in favor of proportional representation, which I think it's fair to say all three of the editors did not support, and he can explain why. It isn't going to happen. I think it would make things worse. And so I'll just say that I continue to believe at the end of our study what I believed at the beginning, but with even deeper conviction, despite these election results for the voter initiatives, that I think the combination of ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries will give us the biggest achievable improvement in the quality of our democracy. And if we can get it with the Condorcet twist, I favor that. If not, maybe we can improve the initial adoption a little bit later with that as we learn more from experience. But I think we shouldn't be deterred by the defeat of most of these voter initiatives. We should learn from it and move forward.
So I want to talk a little bit about our analysis of campaign finance and appropriate directions for reform. But before I do, let me just say a couple of things about the discussion we were just having. So we all agree, I assume most Americans would agree, we want people elected who represent the preference of a majority of the electorate, whatever the electorate is, statewide, local, in a congressional district. And when you have multiple candidates, the point of Condorcet's theory and Ned's kind of application of it here is this is the best way to determine who a majority of the electorate actually prefers when you have multiple candidates running. I mean, that's sort of the normative purpose, which I want to make sure people kind of hear behind the Condorcet method. So if we could run elections in a way in which each candidate could be pitted head to head against every other candidate, then if there's a candidate who wins all of those competitions, that is by definition the person the majority of the electorate prefers. And that's what's behind the emphasis on the Condorcet principle. Now, I should also say, if you have an electorate that's very ideological to the left or to the right, you're going to get an ideological winner because that's who a majority of that electorate actually prefers. So it's not that this method or some of the other things we're talking about necessarily, prefer more centrist candidates. It depends on the underlying nature and preferences of the electorate. But a very important point here, I think, is there are lots of studies of voters that suggest voters are much less polarized than the people we send to office. And that's why this question is so acute of whether the way our institutional mechanisms are structured for selecting candidates, for nominees and then winners, actually doesn't give us representatives. Because candidates who actually would be the preference of a majority of the general electorate voters are eliminated, early on in the process through partisan primaries. And so more factional candidates emerge, maybe one from each party, even though there are candidates left on the table because they couldn't get through the party primary, who a majority of the voters in that jurisdiction would actually prefer. So that's what's kind of driving all of this. And I just want to make sure that that comes across clearly. On campaign finance, when we talk about campaign finance, almost all the discussions center around, questions about political equality or the inequality of where money comes from in elections, or the risk of political corruption that, office holders are beholden to their donors. But I think we have not recognized how much our system of financing elections also contributes to the polarization in our politics. Because one of the things that we know, it's a very robust finding in the empirical literature on campaign finance, is that individual donors are much more polarized. They're much more ideologically extreme than voters as a whole. That's true about large donors. It's true about small donors. We now have this, explosion of small donor financing through the internet. I think small donors are even more prone to fund more ideologically extreme candidates, or more ideologically extreme candidates are more dependent on small donors. But individual donors in general, we know, are much more from the poles of the ideological spectrum than voters as a whole. And one of the things that distinguishes the US from other major democracies is that we have privately financed elections. Most democracies have public financing for their elections. Now, a second thing about the way our elections are financed is partly because of congressional legislation and partly because of Supreme Court decisions. The structures drive money away from the political parties to all of these outside groups, or these very large individual spenders who create these super PACs that then spend millions of dollars trying to support various candidates. And part of what's happened is we've taken money away from the political parties and driven it towards these outside groups. Congress did this with McCain-Feingold when it limited the political parties in various ways. Congress actually did it starting in the 1970s when it imposed various restrictions on political party cooperation with their candidates. And one of the things our report emphasizes is that however much we despise political parties for various reasons or in various ways, which we have good reason to, they're actually very important players in any democratic system. Political parties do a lot of critical things. They create teams that then can actually drive through difficult pieces of legislation if they can get all of their kind of members on board. When a lot of money goes to outside groups, it makes it much harder to do that because those outside groups have their own distinct interests. And if members can be reliant on outside groups, they don't have to go along with the party agenda as strongly. We know that the ability to raise small donations through the internet and to get lots of attention through the internet and through cable television also makes candidates a lot more free agents politically. And that is not necessarily a good thing for the system, because to make this complex system of bicameralism and separation of powers work, you need strong parties that can compromise, that can drive legislation through the process, that can make difficult decisions and protect their members, because they all sort of, if they go along as a team, they're sort of protected. If they are kind of standing out there, isolated individuals, it's much easier for special interests to control them. So anyway, one of the proposals that we think is a bad idea for political reform, which is a proposal that has a lot of currency in the political reform community, is a system, a national system that would match small contributions to candidates with public money. So $6 of public money for every dollar under $250 a candidate raised. There are attractive features to this, which is why many reform groups propose the idea. It would enhance the role of smaller donors who might not have as much money. It might increase participation. But we think this would fuel the polarization in our politics, because once you understand that individual donors are much more ideologically extreme than voters as a whole, you can see the way that throwing all this public money on top of the preferences of individual donors would help fuel that polarization that we're trying to resist. So the book, I don't want to go too far beyond what the book actually proposes, or lock in any of my fellow task force members to proposals they might agree with. So I'll say, for me, if we're going to have public financing, I prefer more traditional forms of public financing, which about 12 states use, in which the money comes from the sort of general treasury. Candidates get grants of a certain amount. They agree not to raise additional money. And that's a system of public financing that's ideologically more neutral. It's just general public funds, not tied to the views of individual donors. The second thing about campaign finance is this will be counterintuitive to many people, but we think reforms that push money back towards the political parties are a good thing and would be desirable, because the political parties, among the many things they do, they fund candidates of all sorts of ideological orientations. They want candidates who are going to win in competitive seats. Might be a moderate candidate, might be a more ideologically extreme candidate. They fund challengers if challengers have a reasonable shot of winning. So we think it would be a good thing to get more money into the political parties. And if we're going to change financing, have a public financing system that's not tied to the preferences of individual donors, which are a very unrepresentative set of preferences. So that's what we came up with on campaign finance to stimulate more thinking about that. Larry mentioned proportional representation, which is a reform that's getting some currency in reform groups. I'll just say a teeny bit about that. So some of our members on the task force support the idea of having proportional representation for the House. It's not proportional representation in the way you might think of it. It's not, as many countries use proportional representation, that everybody would run statewide, and whatever candidate got 10% of the vote, or whatever party got 10% of the vote, that party would get 10% of the seats. In that system, the worry is individual voters won't have a representative they can actually identify as their representative. So the reform proposal actually is a proposal that we move from single member congressional districts in which you elect one person to much bigger multi-member districts in which you would elect, let's say, 5 people to Congress. So instead of districts having 750,000 people, they'd have roughly 2.5 million people or something like that. and 10 people would run. You would vote for 5 of those candidates. This requires changes in the voting rules, so it introduces questions about more complicated systems of voting, which I won't go into here. It also requires expanding the House to about 700 members so that you could get more states that could have at least one district of 5 members. And the hope among reformers, there are many arguments they make in favor of this proposal, but I think the main one is that this would break up this more tribalistic system of 2 parties in which each party is determined to undermine the other party, and that there would be 5 or 6 parties in Congress, and various coalitions would form in this sort of happier version of the story on different issues, and we would break some of the logjam and some of the paralysis. Now, I'm very skeptical about this, as is Larry and Francis Lee, who's a part of our task force, and another political scientist. Not actually sure what Ned's view is exactly, but I won't speak for him here. And my major concern about this is if you look at the multi-party systems in Europe today, they are massively dysfunctional. France is essentially ungovernable. And I mean that literally. Germany is governed for the first time by a 3-party coalition, and even with 3 parties, it's dysfunctional. Their government has also collapsed, and they will have to go to early elections. And you can look at the multi-party systems in Europe over the last 10 or 15 years, whether it's in Spain, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, not just France, and Germany. It goes on and on. What we're seeing in almost all of these democracies is as they have become 5 or 6 party, multi-party systems, they have become unable to deliver for their citizens. The major parties are collapsing. It's led to the rise of all sorts of insurgent parties on the right, the left, of various ideological orientations. I think a 5 or 6 member party house would make governance even more difficult than it is. And since I am very motivated, as I think all of us are, by trying to figure out how we can make this system deliver more effective governance, I think this would be a mistake, which is why I'm quite skeptical about that. So we're getting near to the end of our time. Let me turn it back maybe to Mike and Peter, and maybe open it up for questions. We can't cover everything that we studied in the task force. We want to leave you reason to, of course, look at the book. But that should give you a taste of what we've done.
Well, we do have a question. Can Robert Padullo perhaps unmute himself and ask about the election process being limited to a time frame? I'll read the question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So the question is, did the task force look at other models that might help a variety of things, such as the challenge that was just being discussed, such as the UK system, where the entire process lasts only 4 to 6 weeks? So wouldn't something like that dramatically reduce a lot of the problems you were just talking about? Was that one of the things you guys looked at? Obviously, that would take tons of money out of the system, I would think, among other things.
So for part of the book, we did look at that in the context of the turnout issue that Larry mentioned earlier. France is having its problems, as Rick said, but their electoral system is a 2-round system that functions similar to what California does that Larry was describing, except that the gap in time between round 1 and round 2 is much narrower. And there's a single national date of that first round. So if the United States adopted a single national primary for congressional elections that was on the same day, throughout the country, and that date was closer to the November general election, for example, in September, there's reasons to think that the turnout gap that Larry is concerned about would be ameliorated considerably, because in France, there's generally actually larger turnout in round one than in round two. And yet we have this terrible turnout problem in the primaries. So yes, changing the date of the primaries and shortening the system could have beneficial effects. And as you said, that could also translate to beneficial effects in the campaign finance side, but it would have other beneficial effects as well.
But also, wouldn't it avoid like burnout and disinterest from voters? Like, if it was a much shorter system, like you could get everyone's attention for 4 to 6 weeks, so that we'd actually care. And why even have two steps to it? Couldn't you even have just a single election running the process and have the Condorcet method if you wanted to on that one day that's nationwide for all elections?
Well, let me just say that, look, the presidential election, that phase of it is actually not as long as you might think, because if you date it from when the conventions actually formally nominate their candidates to the general election, that's just several months, depending on when they schedule their conventions. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. What's really long is all of the process before the candidates are nominated. It's the nominations process. And one reason it would be very difficult to implement this in the United States is that the parties in these other systems have very different mechanisms for nominating their candidates or their party leaders. And they can do that in a much shorter time frame because they don't use a whole sequence of primary elections in the states to get to the nominees. That's what makes us feel like we have this long campaign because of how long the primary election process goes on. But for example, in the UK, the Conservative Party, if they have to choose a new party leader, the members of parliament deliberate and they winnow down the possible number of candidates to two. And I believe the candidate actually has to be a member of the House of Commons. And then they send those two nominees out to a vote of their party members. And their party members are a much smaller group than what we think of as party members in the US. It's about 100 and I don't know, the 30,000 or something like that in the Conservative Party in the UK, because membership in a party there is a much thicker concept. It requires much more, including paying annual dues in some contexts, to the parties. So you would have to radically change the way our parties select their nominees to significantly shorten what we think of as the whole cycle of the election process that we're a part of.
So maybe in short, that's why you maybe didn't really dig into that, because you didn't think it was a realistic option, just as with some other things you thought were maybe too hard to accomplish anytime soon.
Well, we did. Well, as I mentioned, we do have a chapter on the presidential nominations process. One of the things we want to try to drive home with that is just to remind people of how dramatically we changed that process 50 years ago or so. I think it's maybe the most dramatic change to our electoral process in that period of time. We used to have the political party conventions in which elected party figures, local, state, and national, would have the dominant voice in choosing who their nominees were. And starting in the 1970s, we abandoned that system for one that's completely dominated by the voters through this primary election process. That's a huge change. It has all sorts of ramifications. And we do talk about whether it would be beneficial to try to find a way to build back in some formal role in the process for the elected party figures from throughout the country, who would sort of, play some role in helping to filter and identify appropriate candidates. A role that was central to how we did this for 170 some years, and that we kind of almost overnight abandoned in the 1970s when we shifted to this voter-dominated system. So we do talk about that in the book.
And if I can just say one more thing about the role of primaries in congressional elections, because as Rick says, the presidential system has its own necessities in terms of the primary process before the conventions. But going back to the question about would it be possible to do away with primaries entirely for, say, a Senate race or a House of Representatives race, that requires a trade-off between and this goes to Larry's point about, how many candidates do you want on the ballot in November? If you have too many candidates, it causes voter confusion and clutter, and it's an information overload. If you have only two, and there hasn't been a robust process to figure out why it's only two, you have the problem at the other end that Larry said. One of the things that we do very poorly in the United States, in which we talk about in chapter 2, is the most antiquated component of our electoral system is the signature gathering process. It's, pen and paper technology from like the 15th century. You could put that online with electronic signature gathering and decide, instead of having a primary, we're going to, let people over a period of months sign electronic petitions, and then figure out a way that you only want, 5 candidates on the ballot in November, or maybe you want 7 or whatever. There are trade-offs here. So I think if we as a nation took seriously what are our goals in running an electoral system, we could be more creative. And one way we could do that is to innovate at the front end of the process with the signature gathering function. In my own view, I don't think we would want to completely go to what in effect would be a one-round system where all you have is signature gathering and then just one November election. I'd want to design a better 2-round system, but there are arguments in favor of a 1-round system, and I think we need to have a more robust conversation and debate about that.
Just one note of caution, given where I sit in the Silicon Valley, any system of filtration or narrowing that relies on digital signatures and digital means, I get off the bus. The way that the Russians and the Chinese have already weaponized digital interventions in campaigns, and I'm not even talking about debates about previous elections in the United States. I'm talking about Central and Eastern Europe and so on and so forth, and some of the stuff that's coming, Chinese hacking of our data files and so on. Believe me,
Yeah,
we
but
need to
Larry, on that
approach
point,
that with great caution.
fair enough. You got to, but the difference between signature gathering and the secret ballot for computer technology
No,
is.
I understand, but you'd need a lot of means of verification. That's just all I'm saying. And I lean more enthusiastic about it to get people in than to take people out.
I'd like to, Mike, if I could, make one comment about something that Larry said. Larry was very nice to the people in Oregon and suggested that they voted stupidly in the last election. Okay.
I didn't say that.
You implied that, Larry. And let me point out that they did. And this is the core of the problem. If you take a state like Oregon, the total number, the percentage of Democrats and Republicans in that state is 57%. That you have 43% independents or or non-party voters or minor party voters. And the point is that this largest group of voters in Oregon voted to leave the power in the hands of the two parties. That by voting the way they did. I mean, you got to assume that people who are registered as independents are in a closed primary state are giving up their right to help choose candidates. Is that a reasonable comment? And
yes, very.
And so my point is, coming since I never went to law school, that this is a marketing problem. And the reason I say it's a marketing problem is that in state after state, you have conditions where people are voting against their own interests. And what they have to be made to, what we have to be doing is to better market why Condorcet voting, for example, and I'm just taking Ned's point, the selling point for Condorcet voting is very simple. You're going to have more people in the middle elected. You're not just going to have the people on the extremes elected. And what we need to do is simplify these stories, make them understandable, and convince people that we have to do that. These steps will help to eliminate polarization. I'll shut up now.
And represent a majority. Can I ask a question about the future, which is, okay, you've written the book, the task force has finished something, and there obviously are some thoughts about, I think I heard the discussion on last Tuesday about using states as experiments for different approaches and recognizing the different contexts in different states. What are the plans? Is the task force disbanding, or is it going to start working on some of these experiments? And are there target states or target initiatives that are coming out of the work that's going on still?
Well, I would say the task force as a formal matter is finished. Individual people who are part of the task force work with various groups that are more engaged in, kind of mobilizing voters and gathering signatures. People have different, preferences about what they want to focus on. But some of the people in the task force are more activist oriented than others in terms of actually getting, pushing to get these reforms through. But the task force is not an entity to, go out and gather signatures and try to qualify things on the ballot. We work with the groups, not the task force as an entity. Individual members of the task force work with the various groups and reformers that are pushing these efforts. I think let me comment a little bit on Peter's point. To be more charitable to the voters, I'm not. My experience in political reform discussions over 30-some years is that Americans, instinctively, however much they dislike what's happening, are sort of skeptical and resistant about significant political reforms to the system. And it's partly because, they say, look, we've been, the most successful continuous constitutional democracy, in history. There are always unintended consequences to worry about with any set of reforms, and they become risk averse. And I think you have to confront that, and you have to recognize that, and you have to try to work with that. That's why it's important that each of these experiments that gets put into place helps make the case that this is what will actually happen with this particular reform. And on ranked choice voting, we have 2 states that now use it, but we have a lot of cities, a lot of local governments that are using it. So we're getting more and more experience and information from it. With the top 4 primary or the unified primary, we actually only have 1 state right now that uses it, and that's Alaska. And Alaska, is very sort of idiosyncratic in a variety of ways for various reasons. So it's a little hard to be able to point to it and say, you see, it's working really exactly as we hoped here, which actually the study suggests it is. And therefore it should be adopted in other states. But it takes time. I mean, you have to build this up, I think, kind of from the ground level up, get experience with these systems in place, maybe at the local level, then you can move up to the state level. And the history of reform is it often takes, it takes significant time to overcome that kind of status quo, orientation and resistance.
And if I can add, the point that Rick made earlier about how to find the true will of the majority, I think is a point that unfortunately is not well taught in K through 12 education. I mean, as Rick said, virtually all Americans want majority rule. They want elections to be based on the will of the majority, but it's not automatically intuitive that in a multi-candidate election, the way to do that is this head-to-head methodology that Condorcet developed. And so if people don't learn that and aren't used to it, there is a learning curve, and we haven't even begun that process with respect to the Condorcet concept. The reform movement has been around, the instant runoff version of ranked choice voting or the top 2 system and so forth. And so I think as we look to the future, to Mike's question, I think to the extent that people are trying to figure out where to place resources, time and financial resources in terms of reform, I think it's a genuine question about how much should be devoted to some form of civic education to lay the groundwork for what might be feasible ballot initiatives versus trying to go directly to the ballot initiative stage of the process and get something on the ballot to get reform. And that, that's a judgment that I think itself requires some more thinking and some more evidence and that reasonable people can debate about.
We use ranked choice voting more than we realize. It's because it's not given that name, but I think sort of trying to make sure people understand that is effectively what we're doing in various settings. So, for example, when the political parties, are choosing if they're in the majority, who the Speaker of the House is going to be, what do? They candidates come forward, and then they have an initial vote. And the person who gets the fewest votes is eliminated. And then they have another round of voting. And they go through this sequential process. That is essentially ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
It's just not done on one ballot. It's in a context where they have a sequence of votes where you're always eliminating the candidate who gets the fewest votes. And then those people decide who they're going to vote for instead. So I think maybe if there was more recognition of the ways in which ranked choice voting is actually already used in various settings, not under the label ranked choice voting, maybe that would help also in raising the sort of the awareness of the system.
And the bill,
I want to, excuse me.
Can I just say one thing about Rick's that point? One of the things that America knows best about a different way to vote is the TV show Survivor. Because because Survivor is itself methodologically, just like Rick said, a form of ranked choice voting extended over time. So when you vote somebody off the island and then you next vote somebody else off the island, that is mathematically the equivalent of what's called the Coombs method of ranked choice voting. And the Coombs method mathematically has a property of being much closer to the Condorcet system than the other way of ranked choice voting. So if you want to speculate about how perhaps to get Americans to think about getting interested in the more anti-polarization, anti-extremism form of voting, you might think about trying to tap into the average citizen's knowledge of the survivor concept and how that could be used in an electoral system. That's discussed also in chapter 2 of the book.
I just wanted to say, since Rick mentioned Alaska and Larry mentioned not Larry, Ned mentioned Condorcet. For those of you who are amateurs at this, including me, an interesting election to look at would be the 2022 congressional election in Alaska. Because if you remember, that was the election where 2020, I'm sorry, where Sarah Palin was running, and they elected in the ranked choice voting system, the way the ranked choice voting system worked. Palin lost. Palin came in second. Another moderate Republican came in third, and the Democrat won. And if you had a Condorcet system for the same election, it's very likely that the Republican, who is now the incoming congressperson, that the Republican would have won. So there's an example of where you would have a different result with Condorcet than with ranked choice voting. And if some of you are trying to understand this process, that's an interesting example. It's also an explanation for why Republicans are against ranked choice voting, because the Republicans say, hey, we got 60% of the vote in Alaska and the Democrats won the House. So just a point about the differences between the systems.
Michael, can I ask Peter a question?
No, this is professors.
So actually 2 questions. So Peter, okay, I'll take your silence as a yes. So Peter, how do you manage to stay looking so young? And number 2, what do you have for breakfast every morning?
Okay, thank you.
I think this is indicating that we're getting near our hard stop time of 7:30.
Does anybody have a serious question?
What could be more serious than the way we look, Peter?
Peter, I had a serious question that I put into the chat, which is like the Heisman voting as a comparison to Condorcet, where it's essentially weighted and rank ordered. So I wonder if that would be more relatable and easier to execute, and thus also easier to market or educate voters on. Would it result in the same outcome as Condorcet?
No. So the Heisman method is in the voting literature something called a Borda count, because it turned out that Borda and Condorcet were both French mathematicians at the same time, and they were rivals in terms of their different methods. The Borda count is very attractive as long as there's no strategic voting. But it's very easy to manipulate. In fact, Borda himself says it's only a good method for honest voters. And so there's been a lot of effort to think about, is there a way to make it strategy proof? There's fancy ways to combine Condorcet and Borda into a single system, but given I think Americans need a system that they can understand, that they feel is transparent and accessible. And so the fancier the system it is, I think the more difficult it is to adopt realistically. So as attractive as Borda is conceptually, I'm not sure it's feasible in a political sense.
I thought maybe it would be simpler, but I think your point is the important one, which is that you game the system. So presumably you vote for your favorite person, and then maybe you don't even vote for the other people. And that way you get a bigger delta between your first choice and everyone else. Whereas the Condorcet method, if you're forced to answer the question for all head-to-heads, and otherwise your vote doesn't count, then everyone could not game the system, but actually give their full perspective on who they would prefer. So that does sound like that would be the better choice. Thanks for explaining that.
Sure.
Well, I want to thank everyone for both attending and sticking with it past the official end time. I think we clearly do have real interest that people are not just totally fatigued from the last election, or willing to look forward to potential experimentation and better ways of doing things. I like the idea. I think it looks like we need to put together a marketing team as soon as our professors have given us the best target to shoot at. And
We'll
maybe
work on that.
And the good news, Mike, is we don't have to worry about the timing of this because Congress just shut down for the year. So, there's nothing's going to happen.
As if we needed another reason for institutional change in the United States.
okay, I'm gonna put one last time into the chat if I think I've got it, is the link for the book, although it's up at the beginning as well.
Thank you.
But
Thank you, professors, for all you've done to try to advance our country in this, what seems like an intractable problem.
Yeah.
You're making some progress. Good for you.
Working on it.
Thanks to all of you for being engaged and interested.
Slow progress.
And
Yeah.
and
okay. Wish
and we're
luck.
committed to keeping going on this issues, even though the task force has officially ended. As Rick said, the three of us and other members individually are going to try to do all that we can to move forward.
I don't know if I should mention, but there are 3 or 4 different options of acquiring the book itself on the website that I've just put up there. It can also be found on Amazon. Any other final remarks? Otherwise, I wish everyone a healthy and happy holiday. And I do believe we're going to try to have some significant events during 2025, following up on individual portions of the book, perhaps talking a little bit more in depth on campaign financing, or some of these ideas that even came out of that we talked about tonight, like trying to constrict the cycle in different ways, like a single day for primaries, having it at a better time, things that basically improve our representation, not necessarily just get better centrists into the battle, but also get better representation across the board. So thanks to everyone. Have a wonderful holiday, and let's look forward to some better times ahead. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Look
doing
forward
it.
to those.
And there will be a recording of this that we'll put on our website. It usually takes us a couple of days to get it up to that, but it will happen at some point. And I think Ned, did you say that you're going to put it up somewhere as well?
Yeah, yes, we'll put it up on the election law blog and the Common Ground Democracy Substack. So absolutely.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Evening and a good vacation. Good holidays.
Thank you.